Boldwood presents The Fall, written by Evie Hunter and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Lauren Miller was released from prison this morning. At last. Jeff Williams leant back in his expensive leather chair, hiding his elated reaction behind the casual elevation of one eyebrow. "It's thoughtful of you to let me know, Inspector." "All part of the service, sir?" "Well, it's appreciated." Jeff tilted his head, unsure why the inspector had bothered to stop by and break the news in person. "Actually, I thought it was another 2 weeks before she was due out." A combination of overcrowding and the interest that the press continued to take in her case worked in her favour. She was released from East Sutton Park first thing today into her mother's care. "Everyone wants to know what happened to the money she stole, I suppose," Jeff said pensively. "She's a good-looking girl from a privileged background who wanted for nothing, so that makes her newsworthy. No one's managed to figure out what made her throw a promising career away when she must have known she'd be caught insider trading eventually." Jeff nodded, hoping there was nothing sinister behind Reed's shrewd observations. "Had any further thoughts on that one, sir?" "None whatsoever, Inspector. And believe me, I've wasted a lot of hours mulling it over." Jeff stood up, turned his back on the inspector and stared out of the triple-glazed tinted windows that protected his privileged eyrie from any direct contact with the oi polloi crowding the polluted city streets several stories below. "As you well know, her actions had major ramifications for this firm, and we're still under the regulator's spotlight. Her accusations about an affair with you, and her initial insistence that she was acting on your orders when she diverted that money, can't have made your life any easier." "Well, yes, but she soon stopped making those silly claims when she realised no one believed a word of it." He expelled a prolonged sigh. "Even so, it was a bitter pill for me to swallow after everything I tried to do for her." "I'm sure it must have been." Jeff adopted a suitably avuncular expression. "I thought the girl had talent, you see. She certainly had all the right qualifications to survive in this jungle, plus enthusiasm, a positive attitude, and a willingness to put in all the hours God sent. She couldn't have had much of a social life, not if she worked so hard." "I wouldn't know about that. As I told you at the time, our relationship was strictly professional." "Ah, yes, so you did." "I tried to encourage her by offering her a guiding hand." Jeff worried that he'd over-justified himself, and so shut his mouth, making do with a self-deprecating shrug. "Much good it did me." "All behind you now, sir. I just wanted to let you know that she's out. As a condition of her probation, she isn't allowed to contact you or your family. If she tries to, just let me know." Reed slid his card across the smooth marble surface of Jeff's desk. "She'll be straight back inside to serve out the rest of her sentence if she does anything daft like that." "Thank you, Inspector. That's very reassuring." Jeff placed a hand on Reed's shoulder as he led the way across the wide expanse of thick carpet towards his office door. "But Lauren was never silly, you know. Far from it. So I don't anticipate that I'll hear from her." Jeff injected a casual note into his tone. "She'll be living with her parents now, I suppose." "I'm not at liberty to reveal her whereabouts, sir. This protection thing works both ways, even though she now has a record." Reed paused, his hand on the doorknob, his eyes raking Jeff's face in a disconcertingly speculative manner. "Anyway, why are you so interested in where she's living?" "Oh, no reason," Jeff rapidly backpedaled. "It's just that in spite of everything she's done, I still feel a modicum of sympathy for the girl. I obviously overestimated her talents and put too much pressure on her. It's the only explanation I've been able to come up with for what she did, so I feel partly to blame." He lifted his shoulders. "I wouldn't like to think of her out there all on her own." "You don't need to worry about that. The probation service will make sure she's looked after." "Ah, I see. Well, that's all right then." "Good day to you, sir." "Good day, Inspector, and thanks for dropping by." Jeff closed the door behind his visitor, crossed back to his desk, and returned his attention to the view, deep in thought. At last she was out, and he'd be able to get his hands on the money he so badly needed. His money. He'd get his hands on Lauren, too, while he was at it, and give her a mercy shag for old time's sake. She was the best he'd ever had. She'd ruined him for all the rest, so she owed him at least that much. He picked up his private phone and dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the second ring. "They let her out this morning," he said, without introducing himself. "I see. Find her and let me know where she's living. I'm on it." Jeff hung up and continued his rather pleasant speculations about his forthcoming reunion with Lauren. Nate Black bought 2 pints of lager and carried them across to a quiet corner table in the otherwise crowded city pub. He slid one across to Peter Reed, a man who still owed him a few favours. Nate had gone out of his way a while back to help him catch some particularly vicious killers through carefully planted information in his newspaper column. Something told Nate that Reed's unexpected request for this meeting might signify payback time. "Thanks, Nate. Cheers." "Cheers." Nate crossed one denim-clad leg over his opposite knee and leant back in his chair. "So," he said, in a voice that still bore distinct traces of his native Colorado, "they've let Lauren Miller out early, have they?" "Yep, this morning. Thought you'd like to know, given your intense interest in her case. It's just a shame she wouldn't let me visit her inside. Perhaps I could have helped her. No one visited her the whole time she was banged up." Nate's head shot up. "What, not even her family?" "Nope. She wouldn't see them." "What is she doing there all that time then? Do you know?" "Course I do." Nate chuckled. "Take that much interest in the entire prison population, do you? Or do you reserve your attention for the good-looking ones?" "Do you want to know how she spent her time or not?" Reed asked calmly, not rising to the bait. "Sure, I'm interested, Peter, and you know it. Why else would you be telling me all this?" "Typical bloody journalist," complained Reed, "always answering questions with questions." He took a sip of his lager, seeming to enjoy dragging things out. Nate, an experienced journalist used to worming information out of reluctant sources, sat back and savoured his beer, saying nothing. Eventually his patience was rewarded. She worked in the library and studied for an A-level in psychology. She passed it with an A star, by the way. Other than that, she survived by acting as unofficial legal aid for some of the girls on remand. Clever. Nate nodded his admiration. No one would give her the sort of grief you associate with those places if she made herself useful to the right people. I guess that's how she looked upon it. But she didn't appeal her own sentence. How could she when she pled guilty? She got off lightly with a 6-year sentence, and she knew it, especially as she only served 3 years for insider trading that defrauded her stockbroker employers of over £3 million. If she did. Why plead guilty if she didn't? To avoid a murder charge, perhaps? Nate grinned at his friend. What do you think? She wasn't charged with murder. That's because she didn't commit one. It was Reed's turn to smile. You don't know that, Nate. Just because she's a looker, she's got you thinking with your prick instead of that pea-sized brain of yours. Pretty girls from good backgrounds are just as capable of committing crimes as anyone else. He waggled his brows in a world-weary sort of way. Believe me, I know of what I speak. I may not be able to prove that she didn't kill anyone. Nate surprised himself with his fierce desire to protect the reputation of a woman he'd never met and perhaps never would. But you sure as hell can't prove that she did. If you could, you'd have charged her. Just because we didn't have enough evidence to pin Drake's murder on her, it doesn't mean I don't think she did it. Come on, Peter, I know you. Nate shook a thick lock of hair out of his eyes and flashed a smile at the contact who'd become a friend over the years. If you really thought she was a killer, you would have moved heaven and earth to prove it. Reed nodded with transparent reluctance. Perhaps, but she still stole a shed load of money. They do that on Wall Street every day, and in your city of London too. It's called speculating, or profit-taking in polite circles. Yeah, but they get prosecuted if they get caught speculating with money that ain't theirs, or for using information that they've come by illegally in order to make a killing. He paused. Pun intended. Nate took a long swallow of beer, disregarding the two women at a nearby table who were staring at him with their tongues almost hanging out. What she did was wrong, but from what I've found out about her, I'm convinced she was coerced into it somehow. She isn't the type to do something like that off her own bat. Good luck proving it. Nate shook his head, ignoring the interruption. She wasn't in it alone. I'd stake my reputation on it. Some clever bastard pulled her strings, and when it all went wrong, he left her to take the fall. My money's on that sleazebag boss of hers, Jeff Williams. I'm convinced he's in it up to his grubby little neck. The toss is far too smooth for my liking. Good luck trying to prove that as well. Ah, so now I get it. A slow smile spread across Nate's features. I wondered why you were telling me all this. You've tried to prove it and failed, so you think yours truly, with the strength of the press at his disposal, might have a better shot at it. Reed gave a non-committal shrug. Williams is whiter than white. Nate blew air through his lips and refrained from comment. No known debts, top-notch credit rating, happy family life, spotless record with the firm, golf handicap in single figures. That's the funny handshake bit. He shrugged for a second time. What more do you want? Sounds too good to be true. Everyone has something to hide. Nate drained his pint. So where's she living, our Ms. Miller, now that she's out? Couldn't possibly tell you that. It's between her and her probation officer. Not with her parents, then? Reed shook his head. Thought not. I gather they haven't actually been pillars of support, too busy maintaining their social position and worrying about what they'll say at the country club about their daughter's rather dramatic fall from grace to bother looking out for the girl's interests. You could say that. Poor kid. She's hardly a kid, Nate. She's 28, and she knew precisely what risks she took when she got involved with insider trading. All the more reason to wonder how she could have pulled it off without help. Reed grunted his grudging agreement. So, why are you telling me all this? You know I want to talk to her, but if you won't tell me where to find her, what chance do I— Hey, hang on a minute. Nate smirked, offering a flash of perfect American dentistry for the women at the adjoining table to drool over. Between her and her probation officer, you say? Reed nodded, not quite managing to suppress a smile of his own. And most people return to the area they know best when they get out. She wouldn't want to be in the city after what happened to her there, and anyway she'd never get another job in finance in a month of Sundays, so— Nate paused, rubbing a chin adorned with 5 o'clock shadow as he thought it through. She'll have gone back to her roots, which are in the New Forest. He looked inquiringly at Reed, who maintained a neutral expression but didn't actually deny it. Which means her nearest probation service will be in Southampton, right? Reed downed the last of his pint and stood up. I never said a word, remember? Of course you didn't. Reed waved over his shoulder as he pushed his way through the crowded bar and disappeared from view. Nate waited a moment and then followed him out the door, winking at the two gawping women as he passed their table. What contacts did he have in the Southampton Probation Service who'd be prepared to give him the inside track on Lauren Miller's whereabouts? Lauren huddled in the passenger seat of a nondescript Ford Fiesta and stared out the window until the drab prison buildings receded from view. She thought about the eclectic mix of people she'd come into contact with during her time inside. Women with pathetically sad reasons for finishing up incarcerated, almost always thanks to the machinations of the men in their lives. She watched the barren hedgerows hurtling past her window without really seeing them, idly wondering whose car it was that she was riding in. It didn't belong to her parents, that was for sure. They wouldn't normally be seen dead in such a down-market vehicle, and had obviously commandeered it for reasons of anonymity. Marion Miller would never live it down if she was seen hanging about outside a prison, or worse yet, was photographed by the paparazzi as she drove Lauren away. That would account for the sunglasses, presumably, even though it was a drab day and rain was forecast. So this was freedom. Lauren had spent countless hours wondering how she'd feel when the day finally came. Now she knew. She felt nothing at all, other than an overwhelming desire for revenge. That had never gone away, and was the only emotion she'd permitted herself throughout this entire terrifying ordeal. Sometimes she thought it was the only thing that had got her through it. The bitter taste of betrayal was as fresh on her tongue now as it had been on the day when her world fell apart over 3 years before. She could still recall the moment when it dawned on her that everything she'd done had been based on a pack of lies, and that she'd fallen for the oldest trick in the book. She'd been used, exploited, and then left to carry the can alone. Lauren grimaced. She'd been an idiot. But if nothing else, prison had taught her the value of patience. She wouldn't rush into anything now, but would let Williams sweat a bit first. He'd know she was out, and would wonder what she intended to do about him. She'd served her time, couldn't be tried for the same offence again, and as her life was in ruins anyway, she had nothing to lose by going after him. Williams was a controlling bastard, and he'd want to see her. He'd probably imagine that she was still the same naive, trusting individual she'd once been, and that he could bend her to his will with a pat on the head and a few carefully chosen endearments. Dream on, you evil bastard. "It's so lovely to have you back with us, darling." Her mother glanced at her and plastered on an artificial smile. "But you look so pale." "Being locked up all day tends to do that to you, Mother." "Yes, but still, you need to get some sun." "Are we going on holiday then?" Lauren knew they weren't. Apart from anything else, she was on probation and wasn't allowed to leave the country without permission. But she wanted to see how her mother would respond. Well, no, darling, not right now, because... Then where am I going to get any sunshine in the middle of March in bloody England? Her mother shuddered. "That place has made you coarse, Lauren." Lauren almost smiled as she watched her mother's perfectly made-up face twist into an expression of distaste. But guilt immediately banished all thoughts of smiling from her head. She knew how badly she'd let her parents down, her father in particular. Everything she had done in her adult life had been in a vain attempt to secure his attention and approval. She had failed spectacularly, and knew that they didn't believe her version of events, even though they pretended to. That was one of the reasons why she hadn't let them come to visit her. Not that they'd tried too hard. They were probably relieved when she said she didn't want to see them. "Where's Father?" "Oh, he wanted to come, darling, really he did. He's anxious to see you, but he had a meeting he simply couldn't get out of." Lauren rolled her eyes. Some things never changed. "Never mind. I'll see him at home later, presumably?" Actually, no. Lauren watched her mother struggling with her acute embarrassment, temporarily forgetting that she was the cause of it. She'd never felt less connected to her than she did now, but would give what few possessions she could still call her own if her mother would say just once that she truly believed she wasn't solely responsible for what she'd done. They had never been close, but wasn't blood supposed to be thicker than water? She had visited unnecessary troubles upon them as a family and ought to be glad they were still standing by her. But still. Lauren returned her attention to the passing scenery as they sped down the motorway. Maybe it would be better if the connection was broken altogether. Prison and the events that led to Lauren's incarceration had changed her. How could they not have? And she would now never be the person she'd worked so hard to become in an effort to make an impression upon her ambitious parents. "Then where am I going?" she asked, her face still turned away from her mother. "Well, the thing is..." Her mother removed one hand from the steering wheel and wiped imaginary sweat from her brow. "The thing is, darling, since talk of your impending release found its way into the press, we've been besieged with reporters, and much as we'd like to have you there, you'd never be left in peace if you came home." "Me or you, Mother?" "Don't be like that, Lauren," she snapped. "I'm doing my best here." Lauren regretted her outburst. "It's all right," she said, sighing. "I know you've paid the rent on a cottage in the forest for me. They told me that before I was released, and I'm grateful to you, really I am. I'd like to go straight there now, if that's okay with you." Her mother breathed an audible sigh of relief. "And so you shall, darling, if it's what you really want. I expect you're anxious to get back to normal." Normal? Her mother really did live in cloud cuckoo land. Lauren knew very well that her life would never be remotely normal ever again. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's what I want." Chapter 2. Lauren was already awake when her alarm went off at 5 in the morning. She shut it off and lay immobile for a minute or two, listening to the crystalline silence. The soothing sound of dawn in the forest vied with the urge to pull the covers over her head and sleep for the next 5 years. In prison, constant noise and lack of privacy were the two things she'd found hardest to deal with. Now that she had both in abundance, she struggled to make the adjustment. Aware of time passing, Lauren pushed the covers aside. The temperature in the bedroom couldn't have been much above freezing. She shivered as she shoved her feet into slippers and pulled a thick dressing gown on over the baggy t-shirt she slept in. To call this place a cottage would trouble the conscience of even the most silver-tongued estate agent. A shack would better describe her current accommodation. But Lauren didn't care about the reduced circumstances that had been forced upon her by not returning to the luxury of her parents' home. At least she had her freedom. Rents in this part of the world were ruinously expensive, and her mother, to her credit, had done what she could to make the place seem homely. Just as well, because Lauren didn't have the energy to care and so wouldn't have bothered. The minuscule lounge was spotlessly clean, with fresh curtains at the window and a huge supply of logs for the open fire, her only form of heating. The old-fashioned kitchen was kitted out with a mishmash of crockery and pots and pans that she recognised as her mother's cast-offs. The ancient fridge hummed and rattled in the otherwise silent room, stocked with the sort of foods that Lauren could no longer stomach after 3 years of prison fare. The downstairs bathroom, a much later addition to the shack, was furnished with piles of fluffy towels that looked incongruous draped over the rusty tub. The expensive bath foam, also supplied by her mother, was one of the few touches Lauren genuinely appreciated, since no matter how often she bathed, she couldn't seem to get the desperate smell of prison off her body. Upstairs, the one bedroom was supplied with an electric fan heater, that spewed dust every time she turned it on, making her sneeze. The bed was piled with blankets, crisp cotton sheets, and the old patchwork quilt from Lauren's room at home. The wardrobe was full of clothes her mother had brought over ahead of her release, presumably so Lauren wouldn't embarrass them by returning home and collecting them herself. The shelves were crammed with books, much-loved soft toys from her childhood, and photographs of the family group in happier times. Glancing at them caused homesickness to wash through her, but she tamped it down, aware that if she ventured onto home territory, her father would send her a look of deep disappointment that would tear at her soul. He would never understand that she had strived to overachieve in order to impress him, a feat that she now accepted would have been impossible to achieve, simply because she wasn't his son. Lauren made a dash down the rickety stairs, moving fast in an effort to retain the heat from her bed, and crashed through the bathroom door. The ancient and temperamental water heater wasn't up to producing hot water at this ridiculously early hour, or at any hour at all, come to that, unless it was in an especially accommodating mood. Lauren forced herself to endure 30 seconds under a cold spray, which was enough to wake her up completely. She dried herself off and jumped into a pair of jeans and a thick sweatshirt, but didn't bother with breakfast. She wasn't hungry. And anyway, there would be ample time to eat at the Greasy Spoon on the bypass where she worked the breakfast shift. She thrust her arms into her old sheepskin jacket, wound a scarf several times round her neck, pulled on a pair of gloves and left the shack, double-locking the door behind her. It wasn't much of a place, but it was hers, at least for the next year, and she didn't want anyone invading her privacy ever again. In the 2 weeks since she'd left prison, Lauren had already fallen into a routine that was almost comforting in its banality. She'd told her mother in a letter that she'd prefer to live somewhere isolated, and her mother had certainly delivered. It couldn't get much more isolated than this quiet, unmade track. As far as she was aware, no casual passers-by had ventured this far into the forest since she'd taken up residence, and she had no immediate neighbours to give her grief. Her breath came out in misty clouds in front of her face as she wheeled out the ancient bicycle that she'd bought from a second-hand shop in town when she got tired of covering the distance to the bus stop on foot each morning. It had an old-fashioned basket on the handlebars and a bell that jingled every time she rode over rough ground. On the plus side, it was in good working order and unlikely to attract the attention of even the most desperate thief. With a sigh at the pointlessness of her existence, she mounted up, switched on the headlamp, and pedalled off into the pre-dawn stillness. Lauren got up early 6 days a week and went to work for minimum wage at the transport cafe where everyone, except the owner, thought her name was Louise. She chose the early shift because no one was awake enough to talk to her or to care much about who she was, where she'd suddenly come from, and why she chose to work in such a dead-end job. The lorry drivers who frequented the place leered at her, sometimes suggesting ways in which she might like to supplement her meagre income. She ignored them, and they eventually got tired of the game and left her alone. At the end of each shift, she caught the bus back to Brockenhurst, usually stopping at the general store for a few supplies. She didn't care what she ate, as long as it was cheap and kept her alive. And Lauren had a very good reason for wanting to stay alive. It was the same one that had got her through the terrifying ordeal of prison and the stigma of being branded a criminal. It was the one they called revenge. Gradually, she started to recognise a few faces about town, but avoided all the friendly, inquisitive questions about her sudden appearance in the district and kept herself to herself as much as possible. On the one occasion so far that she'd been to Southampton to report to her probation officer, she took the opportunity to descend upon the library and stock up on reading material. She had no television, stereo or radio at the shack, and no telephone either, which was just the way she wanted it. The television in the corner of the cafe was permanently tuned to Sky News, which kept her informed about current affairs, whether she liked it or not. She didn't, particularly. Lauren supposed that she developed a hard shell since going inside. Distressing scenes of displaced refugees in war-torn countries, living in tents and surviving on handfuls of rice. Scenes that would once have reduced her to tears and had her making generous donations, now left her cold. At home, she had large log fires each evening, curled up in front of them with a book, and lost herself in a fictional world that bore no resemblance to her own bleak existence. Eventually, her eyes drooped. She climbed the stairs to her chilly bedroom and fell into a dreamless sleep, only to wake before dawn and do it all over again. Her mother had given her a pay-as-you-go mobile, making her promise to keep it charged and topped up. She'd thrown it into a drawer the moment she left, and there it languished still. Lauren didn't want to speak to anyone, and was fairly sure no one was gagging to get in touch with her. Except, perhaps, one person, and she fully intended to keep him waiting for a lot longer yet. She'd phoned home a couple of times from the cafe. Her mother made vague noises about her and her father coming down to visit, but Lauren knew it was unlikely to happen, and really didn't mind about the rift. Lauren opened the back door to the cafe and heaved an overflowing bin of scraps towards the rubbish skip. For the third day in a row, a small, mangy mongrel lurked there. It wagged half-heartedly at Lauren, clearly poised for flight if she reacted aggressively, but too hungry to run off. Lauren liked dogs and recognised a fellow troubled soul when she saw one. She crouched down and spoke in a non-threatening tone to the animal. He was a mixture of brown and black, with lighter patches that might once have been white, but as his wiry coat was caked with dirt, it was difficult to tell. He looked at Lauren and cocked one ear inquisitively, the other remaining flat against his head, his wide, soulful eyes reminding her a bit of a frog. "Hey, Kermit," she said, thinking that the name suited him. "Are you hungry, boy?" She rummaged amongst the leftovers and found half a burger and a sausage. She threw both to the dog and he downed them in 2 swallows, without involving his teeth in the process, licked his lips and looked up at her hopefully, laughing. Lauren found him something else. Kermit appeared the next day, and the next. On the 4th, he tried to keep up with the bus when she boarded it. On the 5th, she thought he'd taken himself off somewhere else and was a bit downcast when he didn't appear, only to discover him sitting in the trees next to the place where she chained her bike up before boarding the bus, patiently waiting. He wagged his stubby tail in recognition when she approached, and Lauren's heavy heart lifted. She had no idea how he'd found her bike, but when for the first time he allowed her to pet him, Lauren accepted that, like it or not, she was about to share the shack with this eager-to-please little stray. "Come on then, Kermit," she said, wheeling the bike away from the trees. "I suppose we'd better go and buy something for your dinner." She sniffed the gloved hand she'd just stroked him with and wrinkled her nose. "And something to give you a bath with as well." If Kermit's frantic wagging was anything to go by, he was in complete agreement, at least with the bit about dinner. That had been a week ago, and Kermit was now a firm fixture in the shack. He accompanied Lauren each morning as far as the bus stop, and then sat guard over her bike until she returned, wagging furiously when he heard the bus approaching. He was proving to be a good companion, and Lauren found a little optimism filtering into her mood as a consequence. The weather gradually improved, and since the clocks had recently gone forward, the days were getting longer. She and Kermit took advantage of that and embarked upon long exploratory walks in the forest, watching it slowly come to life again. A bit like her, she supposed. They made the acquaintance of some of the shaggy ponies who resided there, roaming free, and became intimately acquainted with the topography of the region. Lauren returned from those rambles physically exhausted and sometimes even hungry, wondering if that was a good sign. Monday was her day off, but it proved impossible to lie in because something caused Kermit to start barking frantically at an early hour. It was, of all things, the postman. "Well," she said, ruffling Kermit's spiky head, "I suppose dogs are meant to bark at postmen, so I can't really tell you off, can I?" Kermit wagged in full agreement and resumed his place on Lauren's bed, as close to her as he could get. Duty done, he immediately closed his eyes again and was soon snoring. But she was awake now, even though it was still before 7 o'clock, and went downstairs to see what the postman had brought for her. Probably junk mail. But it wasn't junk. It was a letter addressed to her that her mother had forwarded on. The postmark was too smudged for her to make out where the letter had originated, but she had a strange premonition that she wasn't going to like whatever it said. She almost threw it, unopened, into the dying embers of last night's fire, but curiosity eventually got the better of her and she ripped it open. The note was typewritten and unsigned. Her correspondent claimed to know where she was living and wanted what was due to him. "Have £100,000 in cash ready and I'll be in touch." Lauren's first reaction was to laugh. 100,000? Where the hell was she supposed to get that sort of money? And who'd want to threaten her like this anyway? Jeff Williams sprang to mind, but he was the last person alive whom she'd voluntarily give money to. It ought to be the other way around if there was any justice in this world, but Lauren could now categorically state that there wasn't. Anyway, if her unnamed, cowardly correspondent knew where she lived, if he'd seen the shack even from the outside, then he must realise that even £100 would be beyond her right now. But he obviously didn't know where she lived, otherwise he wouldn't have written to her at her parents' house. That thought made her feel a little better, and she tried to put the incident out of her mind. But in spite of her best endeavours to find displacement activities, she couldn't stop thinking about it, becoming increasingly certain that Williams wouldn't be behind such an unsophisticated threat. He was a meticulous planner and never took unnecessary risks any more than he did things without a reason. Perhaps the letter's author was one of the many people who'd written to her while she was banged up. Strangers offering to befriend her, men offering to marry her. At first she was bemused by their behaviour, until it occurred to her that they probably thought she knew where the money she'd stolen had finished up and wanted part of it. Even though she tried to convince herself it was just some crank playing mind games, the letter unnerved Lauren, and she was continuously on edge for the next few days. She jumped at shadows, saw things that weren't there, and took great comfort from Kermit's presence. In her bleaker moments, she wondered if the shack was a little too remote, even for her, and whether she ought to stop trying to hide from the world, the majority of which didn't give a toss about her anyway. Perhaps she'd become paranoid since receiving the letter, but she was convinced she was being watched. She'd seen the same shifty bloke hanging around outside the cafe 3 days running. He didn't ever come inside, and it was difficult to imagine why anyone would want to stop in what was little more than an oversized lay-by unless they were hungry or had been caught short. She hadn't seen him for the past couple of days, but if his intention had been to unnerve her, then he'd done a first-rate job. Then she came home from work one day and was equally convinced that the shack had been searched during her absence. Everything had been put back as it was, almost, but not quite. Her nerves were stretched to breaking point by the discovery, and the noises in the forest, once so calming, now seemed threatening. For the first time, she wished she had a radio or something, anything that would drown out the sounds of nature and stop her straining to hear the slightest unfamiliar noise. Her fledgling feelings of optimism deserted her, and she was thrown back into the dark hole of despair she'd inhabited for the past 3 years. This time, there didn't seem to be any point in trying to climb out of it. She took one of her long afternoon rambles with Kermit a few days after the break-in, during which she tried to concentrate on the positive aspects of her life. There was only one, and it never varied. It was the day when she would revenge herself upon Williams. "I'm coming for you, Jeff! Never fear!" she shouted, frightening birds out of a nearby tree and laughing aloud, wondering if she was cracking up. As she approached the shack, she saw a strange man sitting on her doorstep, reading a book like he had every right in the world to be there. She slowed her pace, her heart hammering in her ears, and did a quick mental revision of the rules. Which one had she infringed this time? Being incarcerated at Her Majesty's pleasure did that to a person. Then the anger kicked in. She was free to do as she bloody well pleased, and having strangers foisted upon her did not please her one little bit. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded belligerently. "And what are you doing on my property?" The man stood up. He was tall, probably over 6 foot, and well put together, with thick brown hair falling across his face. A half-day's growth of stubble adorned his chin, and he regarded her through intelligent grey eyes that appeared to miss little. The sort of man a woman would look at twice. Well, any woman except Lauren, perhaps. "Hi there," he said, speaking in a soft American drawl. "You must be Lauren." Lauren froze. How had an American fetched up in her isolated spot in the forest, and more to the point, how did he know who she was? "Not that it's any of your business, but my name's Louise," she said shortly, playing for time while she tried to decide what to do. "I'm Nate Black." He took a step towards her and held out his hand, but she ignored it. "Don't come any closer." She could hear the panic in her own voice. He obviously could too, because he backed off, palms spread outward in a non-hostile gesture. "Right now, just get out of here before I set my dog on you." Kermit obligingly growled, but didn't move from Lauren's side. "Hey, I don't want to bother you. I just hoped that we could have a chat. I tried to come and see you inside, but you wouldn't send me a VO." "I don't know what you're talking about." But Lauren could see that she wasn't fooling him. This guy knew who she was, and she instinctively trusted him. But then she'd instinctively trusted a man before, and look where that had landed her. Even so, some dormant emotion stirred deep within her belly as she confronted him. When it came to men, her instincts weren't worth diddly squat, she reminded herself. She needed to shut herself away in the shack until this particular one got fed up with being blanked and legged it. Unfortunately, it didn't look as though it was going to happen any time soon, since he was still blocking her path. "Just leave me alone, okay?" she said, trying to sidestep him. "Look, I'm an investigative journalist, writing a book about miscarriages of justice, and I'd like to talk to you about your situation. It intrigues me. Has done ever since I read about it." It was pointless continuing to deny her identity, but that didn't mean she had to talk to him. "There was no miscarriage of justice in my case. I was guilty. I've served my time," she said, thinking that sounded like a line from a bad movie, and against all the odds, feeling a wild giggle building inside her. "I just want to be left alone." I think there was more to it than that. He smiled at her, and for the first time Lauren actually considered talking to him. There was just something about him, something in his expression that made her think he might understand what she'd been through. The desire to unburden herself from the weight that had worn her down for too long grew more compelling by the second. But no! She had nothing to say to him and made a fresh attempt to reach her door. Once again he blocked her path. "Part of my book will concentrate on women who commit crimes that are out of character, and the forces in their lives that compelled them to do it." Lauren stared at him. "Got your insurance up to date, have you?" He blinked. Sorry, I'm not with you. Unsubstantiated written allegations are known as libel in the legal world, in case you didn't know it, and people tend to get sued for that sort of thing. They told me you were smart. Don't patronize me. Hey, that's not what I'm doing. He smiled in an infuriatingly lazy manner that she found strangely disquieting. And I don't intend to publish anything that's libelous. The book's been commissioned by one of the big American publishing houses, and their legal team will make sure I don't get carried away and cross that particular line. But about your situation, you can't substantiate your allegations about Williams on your own. But perhaps together we could. How do you know I made any allegations about him? She asked, her suspicions on high alert. It was never made public. I'm an investigative journalist, he said, flashing a set of perfect white teeth, his air of total confidence almost, but not quite, compelling. And I have sources you can only dream about. This might upset your delicate male ego, but I really don't give a damn. You can't fight powerful institutions on your own, Lauren, he said. But with the might of the press behind you, anything's possible. Just go away, she said wearily, aware that she'd already said more than she'd intended to. What the hell? He was either the best actor never to have trodden the boards, or actually genuine. Her instincts told her it was more likely to be the latter, but her judgment was way too skewed for her to take a chance on him. Come on, Lauren. What have you got to lose by just chatting to me? I promise I won't use anything you say without your prior knowledge and consent. Lauren rolled her eyes. And when a man gives me his word, that's supposed to make me feel better? He really hurt you, didn't he? The compassion in Nate's eyes almost floored her. She could cope with just about anything life threw at her except sympathy. Just leave me alone. If it's any consolation, I know what you're going through. My mom was thrown in jail back in the States for something she didn't do. That's why I gave up my column in the Sunday Inquirer to go and help her out. Lauren nodded, without realizing she was doing so. She thought he looked vaguely familiar, and now she understood why. He'd written a popular column in the Inquirer for some years, doing exposés on the rich and famous, his picture accompanying his byline. She'd regularly read it before going inside. Did you get her off? She asked, regretting showing any interest as soon as the words left her mouth. Yeah, eventually. The police thought she was an easy target, so didn't bother to look any further. He paused to cock one eyebrow. Sound familiar, does it? Just go away and don't come back. I've got nothing to say to you. When he didn't budge, Lauren lost it and told Kermit to attack. The dog charged up to Nate willingly enough and bared his teeth. Then he ruined it all by pausing to sniff his outstretched hand. He appeared to approve of whatever scent he picked up from it, rolled on his back, and let Nate tickle his stomach. Lauren sighed. There's loyalty for you. But then Kermit's a male, so what else could I have expected? Nice dog, Nate said, smiling up at her. Just go, she said again, taking the opportunity to sneak past him. Before he could turn around and work more of his charm on her, she had unlocked the door and took considerable satisfaction in slamming it in his face. Nate must have got the hint, because when she looked again he was gone. But she was on edge for days afterwards, lonely in spite of Kermit's presence. Nate had unlocked something inside her, but she couldn't begin to put a name to her feelings. Hope would be an exaggeration. There was no cause for optimism in her life, and she knew all his talk about journalistic resources was just that, talk. Or, more accurately, a means of getting her to talk to him. Whatever, she was sure she'd seen the last of him, and so was astonished when he appeared at the cafe just before the end of her shift, 4 days later. Her usually bleary-eyed and non-talkative fellow waitress perked up no end at the sight of him. He seemed perfectly relaxed, even though it was obvious he didn't belong in such a dive. He was wearing jeans and a leather bomber jacket, but still looked several cuts above the rest of the clientele. "Will you look at that?" said Cindy, Lauren's colleague. "What the hell's that hunk doing in a place like this?" "Not staying long."